Okay, so in this fragment of lecture, I'm going to try and ask what a gene is. I'm going about that a bit, and I used to spend a long time on this, and it was a bit of a thankless task really because eyes would glaze over. And as I mentioned in the first one, if you've read that, it's not hugely important, you know what a gene is, but just have a bit of a vague idea about the arguments might help. Um, the Human Genome Project, which happened in the early 2000s, in which the genes of various humans were sequenced, suggests that we have about 20 to 25,000 genes. Um, the problem with that is that the word gene depends on how you define it. Let's have a quick look at DNA. I think the best way of thinking about DNA is to think of it as being like a ladder, like a kind of thing you might go up to clean out your gutter in, assuming you do that kind of stuff. It's kind of like a ladder. You've got a ladder with rungs going from the two sides between them, and you grab the top of the ladder and bottom of the ladder and you kind of twist it, and it twists into this kind of what's called the famous double helix kind of structure. But basically it's like a ladder. Now the actual sides of the ladder, the kind of the bits that form the helix itself, these bits around here, aren't terribly important, it has to be said. They don't really do anything chemically. They're just basically there to hold the whole damn chemical together, and it basically is a chemical. And the bit that's important are the rungs, and the rungs are made of one of four different kinds of chemical. There's adenine, cytosine, thymine, and guanine, and these are chemicals. These are chemicals which are called nitrogenous bases, but we don't need to worry about that. So basically, AT, TA, GC, CG, all that kind of stuff. So we use A for adenine, C for cytosine, T stands for thymine, and G stands for guanine. And these pair up in a particular way, so the adenine will only pair up with thymine, it will not pair up with guanine or cytosine. So this is why we have A will pair with T, or we can have TA the other way around, as in here, so TA there, or AT, CG, or GC. So they all pair up like that. And this basically is what makes DNA what it is. It's a replicator. It makes copies of itself. That's what allows life to happen. Is this a very rare property among chemicals? Is it is able to make copies of itself with the help of enzymes. And enzymes, if you remember your biology from school, are basically things which can speed up or slow down kind of reactions. So that we can have digestive enzymes which break up food into the subsequent parts. And then we have other enzymes which put them back together. So we break food up into bits and then we put them back together, for example, proteins, to make muscle. So all our muscles are basically the result of proteins that have been broken down that we've eaten and then reassembled in muscle. So it's vital for life, this process of replication. Now, there is a nice little video here, which I'll briefly show you. I'll talk completely over it. There's probably I think there is a very kind of an American here. I'll allow that once. There's an American here who's going to describe this, and I'll shut him up because he's annoying. So I've got a rather less kind of presentorial style here, but basically we've got DNA here with our adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine here. These are and this kind of poo that's coming down here is actually an enzyme which splits it in two. So we can see here that we've now got half a strand of DNA here. Just pause it for a minute. Half a strand of DNA here with the various guanine, cytosines, adenines, and all that kind of stuff, and the same here. Now what happens here is other enzymes drag in this basically in DNA is floating in a soup of other adenine, thymines, blah de blah. There's a lot of this stuff around, and then DNA strand is sat in a soup of all these bases. So with the help of another enzyme, these things are then attracted towards, so they all pair up again. These are the green poos are enzymes, some kind of polymerase enzymes, doesn't matter what it is. So now we produce two strands of DNA. This is how life works. This is how chromosomes reproduce themselves. This is how cells divide. This is how life works. It's all about replication. So if I now try and exit full screen and get back to where I want to be without messing everything up, Yeah, so DNA is a replicator. So it makes replicated copies itself. That's how cells divide. That's how we reproduce, by copying ourselves. Well, not copying ourselves, but DNA copies itself. But it also provides instructions for building bodies. I mentioned earlier on, there's inside every cell with a nucleus, and not all cells have nuclei, there's the recipe of you. The book of you, the recipe of you. DNA is also transcribed. So basically there are other enzymes. I won't go into this. I think there's a link there which may or may not work, but I don't really want to know about this. But basically the instructions are used. So there are various copies of these ATCGs form a language, and that language will tell the DNA how to build bits of your body. So inside the DNA is the instructions on how to build digestive enzymes. Inside every strand of your DNA, there's the instructions in there how to build, how to produce sweat. Inside every DNA, you get the idea. Neurotransmitters, whatever. So so basically, in that book, that recipe is a recipe not just for you, but it's a recipe for making all the bits that your body needs to function: the neurotransmitters, the digestive enzymes, sweat, blood, all that kind of stuff. So it's not just a replicator making copies of itself. It also contains instructions on how to make all the things that you need in your body. And again, errors with this, if there's an error, then it may mean that your neurotransmitters aren't working correctly, which might lead to a mental illness. If there's a genetic error in one of the genes caused by a mutation or whatever, it may make your sweat smell particularly differently to everybody else's. These are all to do with mutations and variation. The standard model is that genes are selected by virtues of individuals passing them on. We've talked about that before, the peppered moth. Always think about the peppered moth. But it could be the case that genes survive not just because they're directly passed on. So in other words, peppered moth reproduces and passes those genes on to its offspring, and it's more effective by virtue of that parent being better camouflaged, etc., as I described. But genes can help other copies of genes in other bodies. This is another way in which a gene can become successful, not because an individual gene copies itself and goes directly onto offspring, but because it helps copies of the gene in other individuals. And this is the bit that everybody gets scared about. Hamilton's rule: altruistic behaviour can evolve as long as the cost to an individual gene is less than the benefit, that's B, to a copy of the gene, multiply the likelihood that gene is in that other individual. Now, the likelihood of a gene being in an individual can be determined by how related you are to that person. Now, we already mentioned siblings share 50% of their genes. So that means there's a 50% chance that if one sibling has a particular gene, then the other sibling has the gene. Okay, if we get less related than that, and we'll talk more about this in the lecture, then it may be the case that if you're cousins or something like that, then there's a much lower chance. If there's a gene in you, then there's much lower than 50% chance of that being in a cousin. If that person is very unrelated to you, there could be no chance of that being in there. This means that in many species, siblings help each other. It also means, because of course, a gene, if it's in me, there's a 50% chance that it's in my children. So this explains this equation explains parental care, because I'm much more likely to help my children because the genes are likely to be in them. So basically, genes build bodies, build brains, which make people, more often than not, but not in all cases, but more often than not, love their children, want to care for their children. Because there's a likelihood that that gene in me, which is making me look after my kids, is helping copies of that gene in my children. And there is a huge benefit to childcare. We can imagine this. I've often described it. Imagine that nobody looks after the kids. They kind of neglect them. They leave them on doorsteps. They forget to feed them, that kind of stuff. Some people do this, but hopefully most people don't. There's a gene for nobody really cares for the kids. Suddenly a gene mutates. This causes the parent to absolutely adore their kids, think they're the most beautiful things in the world. That's going to motivate them to look after their children. And you can imagine that children who are being looked after by their parents are much more likely to survive in an ancestral environment when you didn't have social services and things like that. These kids are more likely to survive than the children were neglected. So that child more likely to survive, but of course there's a 50% chance that that gene for childcare is in that child, because children are 50% related to their parents. So that child is more likely to survive. So you can see then that when they have kids, they're 50% likely to look after their kids. So now you can see that childcare will start to evolve. The genes for childcare will increase at the expense of genes for no childcare. So people often characterize natural selection and evolutionary theory as being about selfishness. Here's an equation which absolutely shows that it's not all about selfishness. I will talk about about altruism towards people that are unrelated to us later on, but certainly when we look at relatives, our whole bodies are laden with things which aren't for us. Yeah, our sexual organs aren't for us. They may give us pleasure sometimes. That's a kind of fleeting kind of thing, that's a proximate thing, but why do we have them? Why do we have sexual organs in the first place? To allow our genes to get out of our bodies. Our genes have built little escape routes to allow them to get out of our bodies so that they can take part in this mixing process and produce genetically variable offspring. Mammary glands, breasts for example, they aren't for women, they aren't even for men, but what they probably are for, what they almost certainly are for, is they're devices which are there to allow women to feed offspring. They're for many other things too, but that's the ultimate reason to feed offspring. So these are all, if you like, organs of altruism. They're not for us, they don't help us in any way. We have adapted to them, but they're there for other individuals. So this is the evolution of non-selfishness, and we find this in many offsprings, more of this later. There are other examples where genes can take control of other organisms. Click on this link here if you want to watch this. It's a rather scary thing that ants climb up a tree and clamps itself onto a branch. And you think, well, why is it doing that? What weird behaviour. Well, it's actually the ant is being controlled not by its own genes, not by its own brain, but by the genes of a fungus. So a fungus infects the ant and manages to take control of the ant's brain to allow the fungus to survive and reproduce. There are many examples of this. This is called mind control. There are examples of small parasites which can infect, again, ants, but they also inhabit sheep in the same way that malarial parasites infect humans or other animals, and then mosquitoes. You need both of these two to be in both of these two species in order to fulfill their life cycle. How does an ant get into a sheep? How do you get out of an ant and into a sheep? Because sheep don't eat ants. Well, what the parasite does, and this is a tiny little thing, it takes control of the ant's mind, drives it up a blade of grass, bites onto the end of it in the hope that a sheep's going to eat the grass and accidentally eat the ant as well. Of course, it gets quite hot in the place where this lives, and the ant is likely to bake. If the ant bakes, then the parasite dies. So when it gets too warm, the parasite sends another signal to the ant's brain, which tells it to come back down the grass so that it doesn't get cooked. And many examples of this, kind of weird. I mean, there's things like malarial parasite. Again, the parasite causes malaria, is in a mosquito. That mosquito needs to bite a person. So the malarial parasite makes the mosquito more likely to bite when it's in the mosquito, so it makes them more aggressive, so it's more likely to get passed on to the human. When it's in a human, say, or another animal, when it's in a human, then it makes humans smell more attractive to mosquitoes. This is the thing, the size, much smaller than the size of a full stop. You can't really see them without powerful microscopes, but they nonetheless have evolved ways of controlling the physiology of both mosquitoes and humans. I'm going to finish off now and do the final one. We're going to talk about group selection and sexual selection. So that's the final one.